Max was a lone human medic stationed on the Trelian Orbital Station, a neutral hub located in the middle of an ongoing intergalactic war. His days were spent patching up soldiers from dozens of alien species, each with their unique biology and injuries that made the work unpredictable, but that's what Max liked most about it. His reputation among the various species had grown over the years, not just as a competent medic, but also as someone who had an uncanny ability to think outside the box, using unorthodox methods to treat wounds and illnesses. He wasn't just known for his skill, but for his strange yet effective techniques. Max had seen everything. He'd treated alien parasites that were only visible under extreme magnification, cured diseases from planets where gravity was double what humans were used to, and even applied a healing gel to a creature whose flesh was both hot and cold at the same time. But there was something different about his newest patient. Zara, the alien royal, was unlike anyone Max had encountered. She was stunningly beautiful, even by the station's standards. Tall and ethereal, with purple skin that shimmered in the light, she had a calm yet powerful presence. Zara was a warrior and a leader of her people, a member of an alien species known for their strength and grace. She had come to the station after a covert mission went awry, wounded but not fatally. Max was summoned to treat her, and he couldn't help but notice the intrigue in her eyes when he walked into the medical bay. At first, Zara appeared as stoic as her species was known to be, but as Max began his examination, he realized quickly that her culture didn't quite operate the same way as humans. Her species had a tradition where physical touch was not just a form of comfort, but an essential way to express gratitude, emotions, and even power. Max, however, was focused on one thing: healing her wounds. He was a professional, after all, and his mind was on making sure her injuries didn't get worse. As he worked on treating her, Max couldn't help but notice Zara's lingering touches as he worked. She would place her hand on his arm while he checked her pulse, or brush against him when he applied medical ointments to her skin. He chalked it up to the alien customs that he didn't fully understand. But the more time he spent with her, the more complicated it all became. Zara's reactions to his touch grew warmer and more intimate. Max, ever the professional, tried to keep his focus. He tried to remind himself that this was just her species' way of showing gratitude. But every time Zara made a move to get closer, Max couldn't help but feel like there was something more to it. Maybe he was reading too much into it? After all, she was a royal. She probably had all kinds of protocol around gratitude. But that didn't stop his mind from wondering. Was Zara just being polite, or was there more to it? Zara's facial expressions were unreadable, and yet, there was a glimmer of something that Max couldn't quite place. She'd lean in close when he adjusted her bandages, almost as though she were inviting him to continue, or maybe she was waiting for something. Her eyes, bright and curious, kept catching his gaze, and every time she did, Max would feel a mix of nervousness and excitement that he had no idea how to handle. After he finished the first round of treatment, Zara smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was merely appreciative. It was something more knowing. She placed her hand on his shoulder and leaned in closer, murmuring words in her alien language that Max couldn't understand but felt the weight of all the same. It was at that moment that Max realized something. The more she tried to thank him, the more he felt like he was missing a crucial part of the puzzle. This wasn't just a polite gesture of thanks. Zara's touch seemed to carry a deeper meaning, one that had Max feeling more and more out of his element. His professional demeanor began to crack as Zara's movements became more intimate. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't help himself. Zara was beautiful, and her touch was electric. Yet, he was supposed to be focused on her injuries, not on whatever else might be happening between them. But Zara was persistent. She continued to touch him in ways that were far from medical. A hand on his arm here, a soft brush of her fingers against his hand there. Each touch felt like it meant more than the last. Max did his best to brush it off, convincing himself that this was just a cultural difference. She was thanking him the only way she knew how, in her species' traditional manner. But that didn't make the situation any easier to navigate. Every time Zara leaned in or touched him, Max found himself both flustered and confused. Why did every touch feel so charged? Why did his heart race every time she got too close? He wasn't sure if he was treating an injury or something entirely different. When Zara finally got up from the medical bed, she turned to Max with a look that seemed to know what he had been thinking. Her eyes glinted with mischief. Max could tell that she knew she had been playing with his mind, but she was just following the customs of her species. She had been grateful, but her method of showing it was something completely foreign to him. Max found himself at a crossroads. He could play along with her ritual and risk further confusion, or he could distance himself and try to remain professional. But how could he distance himself when every moment felt like it was drawing them closer? What was a medic supposed to do when faced with a beautiful alien royal who had no problem blurring the lines between healing and intimacy? As Zara left the room, Max couldn't help but wonder what was coming next. He had saved her life, but it seemed that his reward might be something entirely unexpected. Zara's injury had healed faster than Max anticipated, thanks to the strange biology of her alien species. As she lay on the medical bed, her skin was already showing signs of regeneration, and the burn marks on her arm were fading. Max kept glancing at her, trying to keep his focus on his work, but every time he looked at her, there was that unshakable feeling that something was off. Zara wasn't just grateful for his healing touch. She was offering something. What exactly that was, Max couldn't quite figure out. She had already thanked him multiple times, or at least, that's what he thought. Each thank you came with an increasingly intimate gesture, from a hand gently brushing his arm to soft whispers in a language Max didn't understand. At first, he thought it was just part of her species' customs, an elaborate, yet innocent, way of showing appreciation. But now, Max wasn't so sure. As Zara rose from the medical bed, she seemed more energetic than before. She moved closer to him, each step deliberate, but with an odd grace that made her presence impossible to ignore. She placed a hand on his shoulder, looking at him with a mischievous smile, as though she was letting him in on a secret. Max tried to stay professional, focusing on his notes, but his mind kept wandering to her smile, to her touch, and to the odd sensations growing between them. "You've done more than I could ever repay you for," Zara said, her voice low and melodic. Her words, though spoken in her alien tongue, had a tone that was unmistakably intimate. Max's thoughts raced. Was this a cultural custom? He had heard alien species sometimes use physical touch as a means of communication, but Zara's actions were personal, too personal for him to ignore. "I'm just doing my job," Max muttered, trying to deflect the tension. But his tone came out weaker than he intended, and Zara didn't seem to take it as an acknowledgement of professionalism. Instead, she leaned in closer, her breath warm on his neck as she whispered something Max couldn't comprehend. Her fingers lightly traced the outline of his collarbone, and Max felt his breath catch. He pulled back slightly, trying to maintain control, but Zara's touch had already unsettled him. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Zara. You're injured." "I'm just doing what I've been trained to do." Max's voice faltered as the words left his mouth. Why did it feel like every time he tried to distance himself, she just got closer? Zara's smile widened, and she reached out, brushing his hand with hers. The touch was light, but electric, sending a jolt of heat up his arm. "Oh, I know you're doing your job. But I was thinking," she trailed off, her eyes glinting with something that Max couldn't place. "You see, my species expresses gratitude in different ways." Max froze. There it was again, the hint that there was more to Zara's actions than simple appreciation. He tried to stay composed, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of what Zara was suggesting. "Different ways?" he repeated, his heart pounding. Zara leaned in even closer, her lips barely an inch from his ear. "In my culture, when someone saves your life, it's not just an honor, they become responsible for your well-being," she murmured. Max stiffened, not entirely sure what she meant, but the weight of her words was unmistakable. Was she implying that she was now dependent on him for more than just her recovery? I'm not sure I follow," Max stammered. His voice was shaky, and his body language betrayed him as he shifted uncomfortably. He had thought Zara was just being overly friendly, but now it seemed like there was a deeper implication. Zara's eyes softened, and she straightened, taking a step back. But the lingering tension in the room made it clear that she wasn't going to drop the matter so easily. When we bond with someone who saves us, we share an offering, she explained, her tone now a bit more serious. An offering of our most precious gift. It's a way of showing how much we value them. Max blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Her most precious gift? What could that possibly mean? He opened his mouth to ask, but before he could get the words out, Zara's gaze sharpened, and she placed a hand on his chest. It wasn't aggressive, but it was assertive enough to make Max's heart skip a beat. Max, she said, her voice low, I offer you my gratitude. And I offer you my bond. The last word hung in the air like a heavy weight. Max's eyes widened. Did she mean what he thought she meant? Was she offering herself to him, in some way that he didn't fully understand? Was this some sort of cultural gesture, or was there something more to it? He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Max had always been confident in his medical skills, but now, faced with this alien beauty's enigmatic offer, he was suddenly lost. Was this a joke? Was she testing him? His mind was a mess of confusion and curiosity, but the last thing he wanted was to mess things up even further. I don't know what to say, he finally stammered. I'm just a medic. You don't have to thank me like this. I'm just doing my job. Zara's expression softened again, and she took a step back. You misunderstand, Max. This isn't a thank you, it's an invitation. The word hung in the air, and Max felt the temperature in the room rise. What was she saying? Was she actually offering something more than gratitude? Max cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I think I need to be clear here, he said, his voice a little steadier now. I'm here to help you get better. Nothing more. Zara nodded slowly, but the smile on her lips told a different story. She knew exactly what was happening, and Max knew it, too. But he couldn't quite figure out how to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Of course, Zara said, her voice like silk. But the offering stands, Max. My bond is yours should you choose to accept it. She gave him one last lingering look before turning toward the door, leaving Max standing there, speechless and overwhelmed by the weight of her words. The room seemed to close in on him as he tried to process what had just happened. Bond? What was that supposed to mean? He wasn't sure, but he was beginning to realize that things with Zara were a lot more complicated than just a medical treatment. Max's head was spinning as he walked back to his quarters after his encounter with Zara. He tried to focus on the facts. She was a royal alien, injured, and in need of medical assistance. He had done his job, and that was it. But every time he thought he had it figured out, Zara's words echoed in his mind. My bond is yours should you choose to accept it. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, but he wasn't sure what. He had been a medic for years, and he had seen all sorts of medical oddities, from bizarre injuries to strange, alien diseases. But never had he been faced with something like this. What was Zara's bond? What did she mean by offering him this gift? Max spent the rest of the evening trying to distract himself with work. The station was full of injured soldiers, all needing medical attention. But even as he patched up bruises and fractures, his mind kept wandering back to Zara. Her touch, her gaze, it was all too much. She had touched him, repeatedly, with an intimacy that felt foreign, yet strangely familiar. He had tried to keep his distance, tried to maintain the professional distance that he prided himself on, but Zara had a way of breaking down that wall. The next day, Zara returned for her follow-up treatment. She walked into the medical bay with a grace that only an alien royal could possess. Max could see the slight smile on her lips, the twinkle in her eyes, and he knew immediately that the tension between them hadn't gone unnoticed. He tried to push it aside, focusing on his medical tasks, but it was impossible to ignore the underlying current between them. She was there again, offering him more than just her gratitude, more than he could comprehend. Max, Zara began, her voice smooth and low. I've thought about what I said yesterday. About my bond. She paused, watching him closely. Max didn't know what to say, so he kept his mouth shut, letting her continue. I know it's not something you're used to. But in my culture, this is how we show true appreciation. Her gaze never left his, and Max couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness. He had always been good at reading people, but Zara was an enigma. She was calm, composed, but there was a certain intensity behind her eyes that he couldn't ignore. I've been thinking about it too, Max said cautiously. He wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but he felt like he needed to address it before it spiraled further out of control. I'm here to help you heal. Nothing more. He tried to sound firm, but even he could hear the doubt in his voice. Zara's smile widened, but this time, it wasn't teasing. It was knowing, almost as if she already knew what was going through his mind. I understand, she said softly. But I think you're missing something. She took a step closer, and Max's heart began to race again. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, but he also couldn't let himself be swayed by it. What if I told you that in my culture, it's not just about gratitude, she continued. It's about connection. Bonding. Sharing. The bond one offer you is not a gift to be taken lightly. Max's mind was a blur. She was talking about something so deep, something he couldn't quite grasp. He had been a medic for years, treating everything from blaster wounds to alien diseases, but this was different. Zara wasn't asking for medical attention. She was asking for something else, something personal. Zara, he said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. I'm not sure what you're offering, but I can't accept it. I'm just here to do my job. I'm not part of your culture. I don't know what this bond means, but I'm not ready to take that step. Zara's expression softened, and for the first time, Max saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I didn't expect you to understand right away. But I think you will eventually. She placed a hand gently on his arm, and Max froze. The touch was so tender, so intimate, that it made his heart race. You don't have to make any decisions right now, she said quietly. But know this, Max, my people don't offer their bond to just anyone. We choose carefully. And I have chosen you. Max opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion, desire, and uncertainty. He had never been in a situation like this. He had always kept his professional life separate from anything personal, but Zara was making it impossible to maintain that distance. Her touch, her presence, everything about her was slowly breaking down the walls he had carefully built around himself. And as much as he tried to resist it, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. I can't, Max whispered, shaking his head. I'm not who you think I am. Zara's smile remained, but there was no trace of disappointment in her eyes. Instead, she seemed almost understanding, as if she had known this would happen. I know. But I'm patient, Max. I don't expect you to accept it now. Just know that the offer stands. Whenever you're ready. With that, she turned and walked out of the medical bay, leaving Max standing there, alone, with his thoughts swirling in 1,000 different directions. Max's mind raced as he tried to process everything Zara had said. A bond? What did that even mean? And why did it feel like he was being pulled in two different directions, one by his sense of duty as a medic, and the other by the undeniable attraction he felt toward Zara? He sat down heavily in his chair, his head in his hands. He couldn't focus on anything. His entire world had just been turned upside down by an alien royal offering him something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He had always been in control of his life, his career, and his choices. But now, faced with Zara's offer, he wasn't sure if he was still in control at all. The questions lingered in his mind unanswered. What did Zara really want from him? And more importantly, why was he starting to wonder if he might be willing to accept her offer? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, Zara wasn't the only one who was changing. Max leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, knowing that things would never be the same again. The days that followed were a blur for Max. He couldn't stop thinking about Zara, her offer, and the tension that had built between them. Every time he tried to focus on his work, her face would appear in his mind, her smile, her touch, everything about her seemed to invade his thoughts. Max tried to tell himself that he was overreacting. He was a medic, not a diplomat. His job was to heal, to save lives, not to get tangled up in alien customs or personal relationships. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Zara hadn't mentioned the bond again since their last conversation, but Max knew it was still there, lingering in the background. He told her that he wasn't ready to accept it, and part of him thought that would be the end of it. But a small part of him wasn't so sure. He couldn't deny the chemistry between them, the pull that seemed to grow stronger each time they spoke. He kept telling himself it was just his natural human instincts, a simple attraction that would fade over time. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. One evening, after another long day of treating alien soldiers, Max sat alone in his quarters, trying to relax. He ran through the usual rituals, checking his messages, organizing his supplies, but it was no use. His thoughts kept returning to Zara. What did she want from him? Why had she chosen him? These questions gnawed at him, unanswered, and he realized that he couldn't keep running from them. The door to his quarters chimed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. He hesitated, then stood up and opened the door. There, standing in the doorway, was Zara. Her purple skin glowed softly in the dim light of the hallway, and her eyes locked onto his with that same intensity he had come to know so well. "Max," she said, her voice as smooth and calm as ever. "I've been thinking about our last conversation." Max felt his heart race. He hadn't expected her to show up here, not after their last exchange. But there she was, looking as regal and beautiful as ever. He couldn't seem to get his words together, so he simply nodded, motioning for her to come inside. Zara stepped into the room, her presence filling the space. She didn't sit down, just stood there, watching him carefully. The air between them felt charged, thick with unspoken words and emotions. "You said you weren't ready?" Zara began, her gaze never leaving his. "But I think you're lying to yourself." Max's throat went dry. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "Zara, I don't know what you expect from me," he finally managed to say, his voice tight. "I'm just a medic. I'm not part of your culture. I don't understand this bond you're offering." Zara took a step closer to him, and Max felt his heart thump louder in his chest. "You don't need to understand it right now, Max," she said softly. "But I think you do understand what it means. You feel it too." Max swallowed hard. She was right, of course. He did feel it. The attraction, the connection, it was undeniable. But accepting it, embracing it, that was something else entirely. He had always kept his emotions in check, kept his personal life separate from his work. But with Zara, it was different. She made him feel things he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. "I don't know if I can just accept something like that," Max said, his voice quieter now. "I've never been good at mixing my personal life with my work. And this feels like a huge step." Zara tilted her head slightly, studying him with an almost knowing expression. "It's not a step, Max. It's a choice. And I think you already know that." She reached out then, her fingers brushing his arm gently. The touch was soft but electric, sending a shiver down his spine. Max flinched slightly, but Zara didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped even closer, her face inches from his. "Max," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "I'm not asking you to take this step alone. We can do this together, at your pace." Max felt a surge of heat flood through him, and he struggled to keep his composure. Everything about her was intoxicating. Her scent, her presence, the way she looked at him, it was all overwhelming. He didn't know if he was ready for what she was offering, but part of him didn't want to walk away either. "I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of commitment," he admitted, his voice strained. I've never been in a relationship like this. I don't even know how to. Zara placed a finger gently to his lips, silencing him. You don't need to have all the answers, Max. You just need to decide if you want to try. If you want to explore this connection we have. The bond, it's not something that can be forced. It's something that grows. Max stared at her, his mind a whirl of emotions. Everything she was saying made sense, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a choice that could change everything. Could he really walk away from this? From her? I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, his voice breaking with the weight of his confession. I don't know if I'm capable of giving you what you want. Zara smiled softly, a look of understanding in her eyes. You're not alone in this, Max. And I don't expect you to be perfect. I don't need perfection. I just need you to be honest with me. And with yourself. Max closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. He had spent so much of his life keeping his emotions at bay, compartmentalizing his feelings so they wouldn't interfere with his work. But now, with Zara standing in front of him, the walls he had built were crumbling. When he opened his eyes, Zara was still there, waiting patiently for him to make a decision. He knew this was his moment. Max took a deep breath, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. I don't know what this will mean for us, Zara. But I'm willing to see where it goes. Together. Zara's smile was slow and knowing, and she reached up to gently touch his cheek. That's all I ask, Max. We'll take it one step at a time. And just like that, the bond she had offered wasn't something that felt forced, but something that Max could now see as a mutual choice. A choice that, despite the uncertainty, felt like the right one.